Hi everyone, thanks for attending our 7th annual Drugs and Devices Reimbursement Update. I can't believe we've been doing it for 7 years. Anyway, I'll launch right in. I'm sorry, just having a bit of a glitch. So for those of us who are joining from overseas, which we always have a few people from the US, I'm just going to do a really quick run through of how things work in Australia about device reimbursement. So actually I should stop for a second and introduce myself. I'm Sarah Griffin. I'm the Director and owner of MedTechnique Consulting, and I'm with my colleague George Papadopoulos, who is Director and Partner of Lucid Health Consulting. And we work together on lots of reimbursement projects. So, quick introduction over. So in Australia, we have a universal health system called Medicare, which unlike the US is for everyone and not just over 65s. We have nearly half of all Australians also opt to have private health insurance. But private health insurance doesn't cover everything. It's just basically limited to hospital and some limited ancillary cover, and generally excludes primary care and most pharmaceuticals. Consequently, we have a bit of a strange mix of public and private hospital systems, which is somewhat fragmented and from an economic perspective results in quite a lot of perverse incentives. So, how do medical technologies work in private hospitals? We're going to really concentrate on this today because this is where most of the reform has been. We have a medical benefits schedule, which is part of the Medicare system, and it's a list of medical procedures that are subsidised or paid in full by Medicare. A procedure must be included on the medical benefits schedule to be covered by private health insurance. But implantable devices, hips, pacemakers, vascular grafts, and a whole raft of other devices that are implanted during a hospital admission receive a payment over and above any other reimbursement, and we call this by the prostheses list. It's a bit of an awkward, anachronistic name and is likely to be changed, but that's what we call it at the moment. So consequently, devices that are not implanted are at a bit of a disadvantage. So, politics 2021, again dominated by the COVID epidemic. We were all quite smug in Australia last year because we really hadn't escaped quite lightly until the Delta outbreak, which led to New South Wales and Victoria, where we are both based, with extended lockdowns. We had a very slow vaccine rollout that was nicknamed the stroll out, which was mainly blamed on the federal government's slow purchase of vaccine and a poor communication strategy. However, that's pretty much remedied now, and we have about, at least in New South Wales, nearly 95% vaccinated. But a bit of change in the power demographic in Australia, where the individual states took primacy in managing the pandemic, and it highlighted some of the difficulties with Australia's system of federation, where in many cases the federal government was sidelined. So a federal election must be held in early 2022, so the government is now in election mode. So the politics that was relevant to medical device reimbursement was that while the private health insurers enjoyed significant windfalls because there was a lack of elective procedures during the pandemic, they still claim that the prostheses list was the main source of increased cost. However, have offered little evidence to say why that is. However, they've run a really concerted political campaign to drive down the prices of devices on the prostheses list. The government has broadly decided on prostheses list reforms after many, many years of reviews and proposals, but there's still a lot of detail to be determined. So alongside the reforms that have been happening within the Department of Health, there's been a House of Representatives inquiry. So the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Health and Ageing is conducting an inquiry into the approval processes for new drugs and novel medical technologies in Australia, and has conducted public hearings and received submissions from over 250 different organisations and individuals. So they haven't reported yet, but a consistent theme of the submissions and the public hearings was the high bar to reimbursement and some of the inconsistencies in the Australian system. So while we have a very in worldwide terms, a very efficient and comparatively well-funded system, it is not without its difficulties, like every other country. So this committee is yet to report, so all the submissions are complete and public hearings are complete, but we'll be reporting, I imagine, sometime in the new year, and it will be interesting to see how the outcomes of this committee and the current reforms align. So there was a lot of headlines around devices. Basically it was a big fight between MedTech firms and the health funds clashing over the prosthesis list reforms. So I'll go through this in a bit more detail later, but it's coming down to quite a tense negotiation between the hospitals and private health insurers for changes in the prosthesis list, which we'll go through. So basically it's a bit of a cost shift and how much of that cost shift is being fought over. So I'll go through these developments with the prosthesis list. So the May federal budget included $22 million set aside to manage the prosthesis list reforms. So the reforms avoided what industry thought was a worst case scenario where devices would have been priced on public hospital DRGs, which was a system that isn't operating anywhere in the world, and luckily that was avoided because that would have been quite disastrous for device manufacturers. However, it's a very, very complicated space with lots of opposing stakeholder interests. And at times the Department of Health appears to have its own agenda and is making decisions before the consultation processes have been complete. So it's a difficult area for the industry to manage, but the industry has, a pretty coordinated and well thought out process for engaging with the Department of Health and Government. So I'll go through the reforms. So one of the first things is redefining the scope of the prosthesis list. So basically, the Department of Health wants to redefine the definition of a prosthesis. So in some ways, that's going to be really good because industry has always been agitating to have some non-implantable items included and remove some of the ridiculousness of the differences between some devices. So, for example, a stent will be reimbursed, but a drug-coated balloon, which does the same thing, essentially treats the same problem, is not. But very contentiously, it will also result in removals of items in the general miscellaneous category. And these include a lot of items such as endoscopic staplers, endoscopic sutures, hemostatic devices, and items that are considered more general use. This is extremely contentious because the Department of Health, while signalling that all these devices are going to be removed and essentially removing their present funding, have left it up to the insurers and hospitals to negotiate alternative funding arrangements, which to date they haven't been able to do. So essentially the insurers want to shift the cost to the hospitals and negotiate some sort of compensation package. And that hasn't been resolved as yet. But nevertheless, the reforms are going ahead. So it might be very interesting to see how this pans out. And we don't know how it's going to end up at the moment. But there's a very limited number of items scheduled to be removed in March 2022. I think they're talking about 8 items which are limited to, fairly innocuous adhesives and glues. But their funding is in limbo at the moment, and we don't know what's going to happen. So we'll have to just watch this space. But there's an announcement due to be made by November 30th, which is very soon. So we will know a bit more in a few days, hopefully. The second part of the reforms, and probably the most important, is aligning the prostheses list prices with public hospital prices. So for years and years and years, private health insurers have always claimed that there's a very, very large difference between public and private hospital prices. I'm not so sure that that's that great now, if it ever was, because I do believe that a lot of prices were cherry-picked by the insurers. And also the industry has absorbed some substantial cuts to the prostheses list over recent years. So that price difference, you know, regardless of how big it is, will have been significantly reduced over the last few years. But it's proposed that any difference between the public and private prices for devices be reduced by 40%, followed by 2 further decreases of 20%. And the first reduction will be in July 2022. So device companies, I think, have been quite transparent and have agreed to provide public prices to the Independent Hospital Pricing Authority. This is the body that determines the prices for public hospital DRGs in Australia, and they've been given the job to calculate any price differences. So the prices are to be calculated on a weighted average basis, which was a win for industry because it was initially proposed that the lowest price be the basis for calculating the difference. So, as I said, the benefit reductions have already been taken place, so there may be less impact than the private health insurers are imagining, but we won't know till we see the final report. Okay, the next part of the reforms are regrouping items on the prostheses list. So currently items are grouped on the PL by, you know, clinically similar groups that receive the same benefit and are meant to have a similar clinical effectiveness and economic outcome. There's currently 1,700 groups, so it's very complex. So modification of this is appropriate. However, the industry is probably concerned about oversimplification because, you know, regardless of the ability to improve the system, medical devices are complex and there's thousands upon thousands of them. So oversimplification is a bit of a risk. And so we do require a bit of nuance to be done in this regrouping process. That's being outsourced by the department to an independent consultant. So we haven't seen that report yet. And the other reform is reviewing the function of the Prostheses List Advisory Committee. So this includes reviewing the listing processes for new devices, which we have not seen the discussion paper on yet, but that should be soon. Looking at the role of the plant in health technology assessment for devices and the role of the subcommittees, which is clinical assessment groups. So this, you know, this has been quite problematic in the past where clinical assessment groups, you know, crossing over into economic areas and a very unclear health technology assessment process for new benefits and new categories of devices. So the new process will outline how to list novel devices and when, very importantly, to refer to the Medical Services Advisory Committee, which we'll discuss a little bit more later. And we want to look at the role of targeted assessment. So this is where a device is novel or has some new level of clinical effectiveness but doesn't warrant a referral to full HTA to the Medical Services Advisory Committee. So the industry has proposed solutions for these, but we haven't seen the department's position as yet. So the consultation paper is to be released by the end of the month. So just talk a bit about MSAT, the Medical Services Advisory Committee. So this is a committee that evaluates which new procedures and medical attendances to include on the medical benefits schedule. It's for the professional service and doesn't include the cost of the device. It's a full health technology assessment with a full literature review, clinical assessment, economic model and budget impact analysis. So there's a few things I want to look at. There's the PICO confirmation. This is a document that is developed when an applicant applies, which I'll go through in a bit more detail. And I want to talk about contractor's assessment. So the PICO confirmation is, I thought I had another slide on this. PICO confirmation is an important part of the process to get right. So PICO stands for Population Intervention Comparator Outcome. So when you apply to MSAC, you initially have to propose these items, and it's really important that you get it correct because MSAC will want all those PICOs addressed, so, you know, the population, the intervention, the comparator, and all the outcomes. And it's difficult to backtrack if something inappropriate or not covered by the evidence is included in the PICO. I just want to talk about that a bit more. So the first part, I think I had a slide missing. The first part of the MSAC process is to go to the PICO Advisory Subcommittee. This committee is a committee that determines these elements of the evaluation. And so it's really important that you engage appropriately with this committee and that you're very, very careful about not including things that you can't manage in the application, that you don't have evidence for. You don't have final control. The PAS, the subcommittee, has control, but as far as you can, it's very important to guide this process so you have a PICO that you can work with, that you have evidence to support. So I just want to go through some of our recent experiences with MSAC. We do MSAC applications frequently, so we get a lot of insight into the developments. So there's a very high evidence bar, and it's not going down. If anything, it's getting higher. And there's a very high intolerance for any sort of uncertainty in the economic model or the evidence. So contracted assessors are employed to critique your submission, your HTA submission, and we found they're of variable quality. And, you know, they do bring their own biases and experiences to the job. So every submission will have to be critiqued by contracted assessors, and this is just a difficult area. And we found that new technologies may be held to a higher standard than technologies that are already included on the MBS. We don't know why, but that we've found that is the case. And recently we've found that even though we've gone through the PICO confirmation program process and have a very specific outline of the elements to include in the HTA that in our submission, we've found that we've been critiqued for not including outcome measures or modelling that weren't specified in the PICO, which makes it a bit difficult when you're trying to follow the advice of the subcommittee and then the MSAC has different ideas. So if possible, try and anticipate any further requirements outside of the PICO if you can. Difficult, but it's important to maybe try and look at the trends in applications and what MSAC is requiring. So some of the things we've seen are expectations of looking at psychosocial harms, and we think this is a result of a focus on the psychosocial harms of having genetic tests, and it's flowing over into other technologies as well. And one thing that's absolutely critical for a successful application, really absolutely critical, is the support of the clinician groups that are going to use the technology. And sometimes this can be difficult because technologies can be disruptive to the business model of some clinician groups, and you can be engaged in a turf war between one group of clinicians or another, or if a technology removes the need for a clinician group's procedure, that can be very difficult. So last year we had a review of the MSAC guidelines, and they were completed and they combine the diagnostic and therapeutic guidelines. An overall improvement, but still overly reliant on the evidence that is more suited to drugs and devices. So the new guidelines and templates were released for use this year, and we're yet to see applications go completely through that process yet. So it will be interesting to see what happens. So nearly there. The MBS review was a comprehensive review over 5 years of the medical procedures and consultations that was subsidised by the Australian Medicare program. And the goal was to modernise the MBS. It's now completed. It had 100 committees with more than 700 members. And the final item numbers, or I believe the final item numbers, were released this year, primarily in orthopaedics. It produced a bit of a stir, but overall was just seems to be working well. So my political predictions for 2022, and when I looked at my slides from last year, I was right. So I might be right again this year. So the election must be held in the early part of 2022. I had the opportunity to hear the Shadow Health Minister, Mark Butler, speak at a conference last week, and it was pretty interesting because he stated that medical devices should not be the whipping boy in private health insurance, which was quite refreshing because every other, previously the government and PHI were pretty much in lockstep about prices and devices being the cause of increased health insurance. But nevertheless, expect continued pressure on governments from private health insurance. If the Labor Party is elected, from my experience over many years, I've found that the Labor Party is less aligned with insurers, but probably also a bit less aligned with industry as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. And I expect there'll be further pressure on the federal government from the states due to the high cost of managing COVID cases in public hospitals, and there'll be a demand from the states for more funding from the federal government, and I imagine there'll be a bit of a war about that. So anyway, thank you, and over to George.
Okay, we're just going to do a little bit of a shuffle here. Hello, everybody, again. It's George Papadopoulos, and as Sarah said, we're back for our 7th annual update. We sort of do 20 minutes each, so it won't be the most comprehensive update you've seen on the pharmaceutical side, but I'll do my best. So thank you, Sarah, and we'll have questions at the end. Hopefully we'll have some time. All right, I'm going to follow a somewhat similar path to that Sarah provided. I just don't have my political outlook at the end. I'm not that good. So just to remind people again, Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, PBS, helps keep medicines affordable in Australia. It does list brand name generic biologics and biosimilar drugs. Key issue is that the PBS is part of Australia's broader national medicines policy, which we touched on a little bit last year and said that it's overdue for a review, and it will be on one of the topics we talk about later. So that was something that we talked about last year happening this year, and it is happening. Just wanted to remind people too, we talk about the PBAC guidelines, which everybody understands, version 5 from September 2016, but the other key document for listing medicines as well is the procedure guidance, and that's just been updated again, just a small update in October. So and remind everyone that Australians only pay some of the cost of the PBS medicines if you're enrolled, and the government pays the rest. And obviously, if you're a concession card holder, your co-pay is even less. So just, I don't think we mentioned it earlier, but we always send the slides out afterwards to participants. So some of the slides are also for information purposes, so you have them. So as I mentioned earlier, these are sort of the two key processes or documents. So the procedure guidance documents, which is on the left, and the PBAC guidelines, which are what we use to get the submissions into the department. And you can see the links there on the slide. The other sort of key thing that's happened, not just this year, but there's been a lot of webinars and updates from the department. It was a key budget announcement from the department, from the government, 2022, providing quite a substantial money and funding to expand the health products portal, which is becoming the central entry point for all the submissions, and it will be expanded to MBS, the prosthesis list, the NIP, and you can see how much money the government's pouring in over 4 years, 36 million, and it really underpins one of the sort of digital channels that the government has. I won't go through the whole program there. That's the slides that you see. That's from one of the webinars the department has been doing. They've been doing a lot of them, so it's worth logging on if you haven't. But it's really, the portal is there to be used as a central point for the submissions, but also evaluations, negotiations, listings, and so forth. I didn't do it last year, but I thought this year we might just spend a couple of times on seeing what is the PBS, how big is it. So the latest report is financial year 1920, not 1920, 2019 to 2020. So in that financial year, the government, Section 85 and Section 100, it's not efficient funding, or the LSDP, life-saving drugs, it's $12.6 billion compared to 11.8 the previous financial year. So that's an increase of 6.7. And then the actual subscriptions are increased by 1.6 to close to 210 million scripts in that financial year. So it does spend a bit of money on the PBS, but you can see that the remainder is patient contributions, so that's at 1.5 billion. And you can also see that that most of the expenditure is directed towards the concessional card holders. And I should just say that this is a report that's available online as well. And interestingly, we talk about the high cost of drugs and so forth, but you can see the average dispensing price, that's patient payment plus the government benefit per script, is $67.34 compared to $64 the previous financial year. And we'll go into some of the costings of that as well. And interestingly, finally, the other interesting statistic too is when we talk about, Sarah mentioned how many items are on the PL and on the MBS. In the sense on the PBS, there's only 902 different medicines, but there's close to 5,500 brands. If you look at the cost by formulary, and we sort of talked about the formularies, I think, the last 2 years, the three main ones are F1, which is the branded products, F2, generics, essentially, and then there's a combination, or CDL, combination drug list, and they're not allocated to any other formulary. But you can clearly see that if you look at the number of subsidised scripts, the ones that are under co-payment, and then the percentages, most overwhelmingly it's F2 drugs, and then followed by the F1 drugs. But you can see the cost, though, percentage-wise, falls into the F1 formulary, which is not surprising. I just thought it's always interesting to see who the top 20 companies by total cost, and Novartis has been at the top, #1 spot, I think, for a number of years now, closely followed by Janssen, and then the generic company Alpha Pharma and Apotex in the top 4. I'm not going to go through all the numbers. You can see them later at your leisure. Okay. So when I look back at 2021 and try to sort of pinpoint some of the things we should present or talk about that happened over the year, there isn't quite a lot, and obviously we can't cover everything in 20 minutes, but I've picked out sort of 6 main things. So there's some, as part of the process improvement, I think there was an update in March on the resubmission pathways, which we'll go through. The updated cost recovery numbers or cost recovery fees in April, which came into effect 1st of July. And what you'll see probably here is a little bit like Sarah, there's just a large concentration of reviews, to be honest. So there's a review of the efficient funding chemotherapy arrangements, the national policy medicines review. The government's also put out an action plan for critical technologies, and I'll go through what that is. And then probably the 2 biggest, not necessarily reviews, but agreements were the 2 strategic agreements for Medicines Australia and the Generic Biosimilar Medicines Board. So we'll go through that. And I've sort of put at the bottom across the whole year, there's obviously the 3 meetings of the PBAC every 4 months, new listings, webinars, which we won't touch on today. So that's Sarah forgetting to mute her phone. Anyway, that just reminded me I've got about 10 minutes to go. It's all right. Stage 2, process improvements. I think the main thing here was that that there's 4 sort of resubmission pathways, and I'm not going to go into the detail of what they all are, what they do, except to say that the early re-entry pathway and the early resolution pathway, to me at least, are somewhat analogous to the minor submissions. And the main thing there is you have a very small window to be able to go to the exact next meeting. So if you get rejected at this upcoming November meeting, you have a small window to be able to make a resubmission and make the March meeting, but you do have a leeway to be able to submit to the following meeting in July. So you do get 2 bites of the cherry. And then the standard re-entry is just the standard pathway, and facilitated resolution pathway. We haven't been involved with one yet, and I haven't heard of one of those yet either. I think the other I had on my timeline, the updated fees. They seem to be updated every year. So these are the arrangements for the 1st of July. I've just organised it for people, or for everybody who gets the slide deck. Top left is the fees for evaluating a submission. You can see the main point there is, especially for category 1 and 2 submissions, which are essentially the old majors, together with pre-submission meeting, it can get quite expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars for one submission. And then similarly, on the top right, it's the pricing fees. And if you go through a re-evaluation, which you just talked about there, the 4, you can see the costs for a facilitated re-entry, standard re-entry, early resolution, early re-entry. And the bottom right is sort of what your costs would be if you sort of had to do a resubmission. Not insubstantial is the point of the slide. Again, I mentioned one of the reviews is the current efficient, looking at the efficient funding of chemotherapy arrangements. So the department is looking at that to see essentially what the EFC supply chain can be amenable to simplifying it, improving efficiencies and having equitable access long term. The report is due to the Minister 30th of June of next year. However, we haven't seen much yet at the moment, but they'll be looking at the patient experience, activities and experience, again in the supply chain, and what the current arrangements are and what's going to be happening. So that'll be something we'll be looking forward to in the following year, 2022. I had mentioned the National Medicines Policy. We sort of went over most of the what it is and what it does last seminar we did last year. But the core principles that we said still remain relevant, even though it was developed 20 years ago. We had said it would need a revision and updating, and had been delayed a number of times. And the review has finally happened. It seems to be very rushed, to be honest. But just to remind everyone, the National Medicines Policy has 4 pillars, which is timely access to medicines for Australians. You have to meet, obviously, appropriate standards of quality, safety, efficacy, supply of use of medicines, and also, I suppose, importantly for the industry, maintaining a responsible and viable industry. And that HTA underpins the part of that as well. So that was a slide from last year. I've got to highlight it in red that it needed revision and updating. And the National Medicines Policy Review Committee, in terms of reference, were released in August, and people were given a couple of months till October to get their applications in or comments. So there were 6 terms of reference that the NMP review will look at. So obviously look at the current objectives, to whether these should be modified or if we should add additional objectives, assess whether the policy, how is it handling, in rapidly evolving treatments, populations, interconnected relations, system-wide capacities, and to me that's sort of the new cell therapies, gene therapies, and the interplay with medical devices and drugs as well. Of course, in the last maybe 12, 24 months, even 3 years, the centricity of the consumer and what their expectations are and needs. I think the key thing here is the definition of medicines, and whether that definition under the policy needs to be expanded to include a broader definition, such as health technologies. And I think Sarah had mentioned earlier the Zimmerman review. I think will have some influence on that as well. Again, improve communications, and then how do we sort of build opportunities to include addressing conflicts of interest. So they were the terms of reference. As I said, there wasn't a lot of time to review it. It was on 30th of August and submissions closed Friday the 8th. I'm sure some people on this call put some in. They had a total of 107 submissions that had been submitted. So we look forward to seeing what that review will come out, and you can see who the expert panel is, and Professor Michael Kidd is the chair. So I think the main update or significant achievements or updates to reimbursement for pharmaceuticals in 2021 were the 2 strategic agreements organised by agreed between Medicines Australia and GBMA and the Commonwealth, or Department of Health, or the Commonwealth in general. Essentially, they've agreed to new 5-year agreements starting 1st of July next year, run to 5 years to 2027. I suppose the four key elements, if you want to summarise it, is funding of new medicines, supply and security arrangements and guarantees. There's a health technology assessment review and enhanced sort of consumer engagement. And you can find fact sheets on this online as well if you want to do your reading. So just some simple updates on the Medicines Australia one. I think it was a couple of main things. I think it sort of solidifies or secures the 2.8 billion in new investments, especially for F1 medicines. That was announced in the budget as well. It was a big announcement of the 2021 budget. Another policy review, HTA policy and methods review, and sort of new frameworks for risk share agreements. And I'm just going to go through, I won't go through all of it because I want to leave some time, but there's issues on the comparators of discount rates, and so forth. And then I think the other thing, one of the main things to come out of is the HTA policy review. And so I think some of the important areas that they want to look at selection of comparators, how do we evaluate rare diseases for reimbursement, evaluation of new and emerging technologies, as I mentioned, cell and gene therapies, or even maybe more specific precision-based medicines. And I do think that's going to be wrapped up with the Zimmerman report and also the National Medicines Policy. And again, there are new methods for evaluating new medicines. I think the interesting one is looking more formally at the use of real-world evidence, which is obviously data or evidence outside the randomised control paradigm. I think the second last one's also, the last two are quite interesting too in terms of managing uncertainty, which we hear a lot about, and exactly how that might be more structurally or formally ascertained or developed. Then lastly, I think it's happened a lot on the regulatory side. It's been spoken a lot on the reimbursement side, but it's never really come to any formal fruition, although I do think the various government agencies talk to each other, but the feasibility of international work sharing for reimbursement submissions, I think there'll be issues there about confidentiality and so forth. It's a detailed slide. I'm not going to read this all here, but on the GBMA side, I think there's some key issues around floor prices and how they're going to be adjusted to help support that sector. The issue of having guaranteed supply as well. I think one of the main things for the industry is the inclusion of public hospital pricing being introduced in the post-disclosure framework. That's probably the first time. I mentioned the default supply, and then I think as part of the COVID issues and so forth is the issue of Section 19 of the Therapeutic Goods Act, so allowing temporary TGA approvals of products that are have short supply or no supply, to have them both on the TGA or available in Australia and also on the PBS. And then, of course, a strategic agreement for Medicines Australia and GPMA wouldn't be complete without further proposed statutory price reductions. So, and of course, they've been rushed through, well, not rushed through, they've been put through legislation, probably the quickest of all the things. And this is a summary of proposed price reductions at 15th and 15th anniversaries and so forth. I think we've got a question coming, but we'll do the questions at the end. And there's just some of the dates, the increases. And actually the bill is one at the top. It's currently within Parliament. I think they've done 2 readings. So it's the National Health Amendment, enhancing the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme Bill 2021. That's before Parliament. And then lastly, just to leave some time for questions, is the government has been very active in trying to be seen to be acting and supporting not just the industry but technologies. And there's an action plan just released this month that identifies critical technologies that are in our interest, Australia's interest, and also, I mean, from their point of view, demonstrate that the Australian government's kind of is active in this area. And on the left-hand side, I've just highlighted, you can see it's not strictly health technology or pharmaceuticals, it's a lot of issues there, a lot of interest areas, including quantum physics and AI and computing and advanced materials. But the one that I've highlighted that is of interest to our industry is sort of the biotechnology, gene technology and vaccines, which is a very key area for our industry. What does that mean? It means that the government is keen to support either through the MRFF or other funding mechanisms, certain areas within the biotechnology, gene technology and vaccines. So you can see there it's manufacturing, biomaterials, genetic engineering, next-gen sequencing, nanotechnology, nanorobotics, neural engineering. I think a key one for our industry is the novel antibiotics and antivirals, and similarly nuclear medicine and radiotherapy, which sort of dovetails between pharmaceutical and the MedTech sector. Synthetic biology, which I don't really have looked at a lot, but you can see it's manufacturing animal-free meat and dairy products, not my area of expertise. But then, especially within the last 2 years of what we've lived through, sort of vaccines and medical countermeasures, so we have a sustainable industry and supply chain. So, excuse me. So that's Sarah and I's 7th annual update, and I think I will just try and see if we've got some questions. I think we do. Let me just have a quick look into the Q&A. 1 second. Oh. Let me have a look here. Okay. Maybe I'll ask Sarah first. Sarah, what do you think the impact of devices not being included in the MBS item fee? It's a great question.
It is a great question. Who did that? Hey, look, what I think is increasingly becoming a problem is that new technologies are being developed that that replace a hospital admission with an outpatient or office-based procedure, and it relates to a device. And the thing is that out of hospital, there's no reimbursement for the device. So if you have a procedure in a public hospital or a private hospital, everything that happens to you during that hospital admission is covered by either your public hospital funding or the private health insurance, including any device that's used. However, you move out of hospital, and if you're in a doctor's office, only the MBS covers that, and the MBS is only for the professional fee. So if you have a device that may cost $1,500, there's no funding for that. So that'll be an interesting area for the government to pursue, and I believe there's an awareness of it, but probably an unwillingness to deal with it at the moment. And MSAC, has to abide by the current funding structure, and so really can't do a lot about it either. So I think it's an issue for government, but it really does need to be moved on. Your turn.
I'll read my own question.
Yeah.
Question to myself, to me, sorry. What did I think the impact of a change of government would be on the pharmaceuticals? I'm a cynical person. I think it just rolls on the same way. Less, pressure on prices, pressures on budgets and funding. I think the health ministers are beholden to Treasury and Finance.
Yeah, well, that always happens in the budget doesn't, the money doesn't change from one government to another.
Would you agree, Sarah?
I think so. I think there's different priorities, but they're at the margins.
Yeah. And,
unfortunately, I don't think there's either side is up for, really strong structural reform.
Well, there's also, next year there will be some big reports to respond to.
Yeah.
Like I said, the Zimmerman report, National Medicines Policy, the efficient funding. They're all initiated by a Liberal government or under a Liberal government. If there's a change, will they want to delay and review? And I think, from my personal opinion, I think out of those, I think the efficient funding is probably the easier one to deal with. I'm very curious to see what Trent Zimmerman and his cohort come out with.
Yes, my local member.
He's our local member.
Yeah.
And then also I think the big ticket item, I think the definition of what his health technology and medicines, as we look at the National Medicines Policy, is also another big issue. So the willingness of I think if there's no change in government, then it would be okay. I think those things might move along, but if there's a change in government, it might be stalled again, which is disappointing.
Yes. So anyway, we will see. Exciting times. But anyway, we'll wind up now. Thank you very much for attending. We'll post the link to the webinar. Oh, we've got one quick question.
That's a good question. What's our take on the increase in health apps? What do you think HTA bodies will do with interventions that are heavily tied to apps, instant EG, constant heart rate monitoring?
Oh, look, it's a really difficult one. And there's increasingly things going to the MSAC that involve algorithms and cloud-based, monitoring of various and diagnosing of various conditions. I think they'll struggle to deal with it. Not that they can't be assessed by HTA bodies, but who's going to be the funder and how it's going to be paid for. And to some degree, I think this will come under the general practice and primary care, but I don't think they deal with it well too. There's some sort of like the chronic care programs and chronic care packages and things like that.
I think they will struggle, but I also think it's probably the one area where non-randomised clinical trial evidence will have to be a lot more prominent or a lot more given value. That's a terrible phrase to use in this context. But I think, back to the earlier question, I think the MBS is going to struggle, like it does at the moment, about being a service item, a fee for service, as opposed to a fee for an item plus a service potentially.
Yeah.
But again, I'm hoping within the national policy, with National Medicine's policy review, that definition of what a health technology is and who should pay for it may become clearer, and we have an underpinning for a way forward. I'm an optimist.
I'm an optimist too, George. Okay, well, look, thank you everyone for attending. We'll post the link to the recording to the webinar on our respective websites, and we'll share the presentation with all the attendees. So thanks very much. Have a happy Christmas.
Yeah, Happy New Year. See you. Will we do this again next year, Sarah?